What I find is that many people who love and they want to follow Jesus, and they have a high view of the scriptures, a high view of their authority and origins as a divine word to God's people. And that's a conviction that I hold too. But what I find is that people tend to hold that view in a way that makes the accessible, knowable, look it up on Wikipedia, history of the Bible, actually makes it somewhat dangerous. There's some category shifting that needs to take place, and I at least want to put the categories on the table, help us identify the problem, and maybe this isn't your problem, but I guarantee that's a problem for somebody that you know and care about.
Welcome to another episode of Ring Them Bells. We believe in the power of the good news and that Jesus has defeated evil and is king of our world. We exist to help you rediscover the supernatural focus of your Bible. We believe that the supernatural focus has been suppressed, and we're here to help bring that back into the light. We do that through incredible content creation. We have mashups and interviews with some of the best scholars featuring N.T. Wright, Tim Mackie of the Bible Project, and Dr. Michael Heiser. All of this content creation supports our nonprofit ministry here at Ring Them Bells, where we provide pop-up feeding centers for the homeless and also specialize in hurricane relief. If you haven't yet, please take a second. It only takes a moment for you, but means so much for this ministry. Subscribe and turn on the alerts, as this is the best way to connect with our channel.
If you start reading the Bible from the beginning, you'll get about halfway through the second book, Exodus, and you'll come to a bunch of ancient laws.
Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that.
Now, these laws are all written in the literary style we call prose discourse, and they're found all over the second, third, fourth, and fifth books of the Bible. There's over 600 laws.
And since reading ancient law code isn't something you and your friends do a lot, odds are you're going to struggle. So, let's talk about how to read the law in the Bible.
So the first thing to remember is that the Bible is not a behavior manual with a complete list of what to do and not to do to make God happy.
Right, the Bible is an epic narrative. But in the story, God does tell people what to do.
For sure. The story begins with God's plan to rule the world through humans who will trust him and live by his wisdom. And here we find the first divine command in the Bible.
Don't eat from the tree of knowing good and evil, because the day you do, you'll die.
But the humans take the authority to know and define good and evil for themselves, and it's not good. It leads to a world of violence and death, and they're exiled from the garden.
Okay, so this was the first law in the Bible?
Well, it's the first divine command, and it invites people to trust God and live by his wisdom. And so while it's not part of the laws given to Israel, it does foreshadow them, because those too are invitations to trust God's wisdom.
So when do the laws of Israel come?
Okay, here's the story. Israel is enslaved in Egypt, so God saves them and then invites them into a covenant relationship, like a marriage. And the laws make up the terms of that covenant.
And so do we get a catalog of all these laws that God gave Israel?
Actually, no, we don't get all of the laws, only examples. And these have been strategically placed in between stories about how Israel keeps violating the laws.
So I'm supposed to see that Israel's no different than the humans in the garden. They don't trust God or live by his wisdom.
When we say as an organization, we want to help people experience the Bible a certain way, as a unified story leads to Jesus, that also raises the question when you hear it, oh, well, how have I been experiencing the Bible?
Right.
Is that how I experience the Bible?
Mm-hmm.
And if not, why not? And what does it involve then to engage the Bible this way? It's vitally important that we bring out those paradigms into the open so we can tinker with them, because there are some more helpful paradigms that are more in tune with what the Bible is and designed to do. And then there are a charitable way is to say, I think, less helpful paradigms. Reframe to say we can actually do many of the same things that our unhelpful paradigms want us to do, but in a frame that's more in tune with the Bible.
biblical writer is writing this down, recording whatever he's recording, I think his entire intent is to be reliable in the things he's recounting. But I will say it's not going to conform in certain respects to what we would expect a historian today to do, or historians today would expect to do. And my own view is that that's unnecessary. It is unnecessary for me to take my modern context of how we do history and impose it on the biblical writer and then judge the results according to the failure to live up to my standard that I imposed.
So emphatically, what we're attempting to do is adopt a paradigm, a set of expectations and a view that is native to the biblical literature itself.
The way the Bible thinks of itself?
The way that it was designed, the assumptions with which it was designed and created. And we're looking for a paradigm that's in tune with what the Bible was designed to do.
The Bible should shape my view of reality and what's true about the world, God, myself, and others.
And when we say should, what we're saying is that's what these texts have always done and were designed to do.
Yes. But how does it do it? It doesn't do it as a reference book where you find the Bible answers.
Yeah.
It does it as...
It does it through the medium of narrative and poetry and first century letters.
Yeah. And then we'll get to this.
Yeah.
But it becomes meditation literature.
Yeah.
And
We'll
wisdom
get there.
literature. Okay.
That's right. So another predominant reference book approach to the Bible is treating it as a moral handbook or a rule book. And you had a lot of traction or experience of this.
Yeah.
And you're growing up.
Totally. But it's tricky because if you're paying attention just a little bit, you realize there's no consistency in kind of how that's done.
Oh, from tradition to tradition.
Even within the tradition.
Oh, even within Christian traditions.
Yeah,
Sure.
even within my
Totally.
tradition.
Yeah,
It's
totally.
just like, cool,
yeah.
we're really set on this rule here because Paul said this in this letter. But he also says this over here.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
And we actually don't think that
and then
matters.
Leviticus says this over here.
Right. and that's, yeah.
Right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And so
yeah, you're saying there's these unspoken assumptions at work where in each Christian tradition, it differs from tradition to tradition. These are the parts of the Bible that we take as face value as moral guidelines. But then there's other parts of the Bible, and we have a special approach to that.
Right.
We have a way to explain why that's different than the part we appeal to. And then what's tricky is outsiders to that tradition, whether they're other Christians or people who don't follow Jesus or didn't grow up around the Christian tradition. It's confusing. And in Christianized cultures, historically Christianized cultures, it's very confusing to people who aren't followers of Jesus to say the times that Christians in public appeal to this book, it's usually when moral issues are at stake.
Yeah.
A Christian will say, I have this moral conviction because it says this in the Bible.
Yeah.
And so people who don't follow Jesus, that trains them too, that the Bible is a moral rule book. That's primarily what it's designed to do.
Yeah.
And then people who don't follow Jesus will read the Bible. Those often start at the beginning. And then they'll get to the law codes in the Old Testament. And they're like, what? Tell me this is from your moral handbook, about stoning somebody who breaks a Sabbath.
Right.
Or whatever. So if even inside and outside the tradition, it feels inconsistent. People can sense that pretty easily.
Right.
That's one liability of the moral handbook approach.
Well, and in my tradition, it was with the Old Testament laws, there was kind of this understanding of you're not doing those things. Although even there it was inconsistent because every once in a while it's like, but that one there.
Yeah, you quote. Yep, exactly.
I mean, like the Ten Commandments, except for the Sabbath.
Right. Well, that's right.
But there were certain ones in there that were really important to point out. But then obviously other ones that you're just like, of course not. But then where it got a little bit more strict was New Testament letters. Like if it's in the New Testament letter,
sure,
that's a rule. But then even there, you would find opportunities to kind of
that's right.
fudge it a little bit.
That's right. And we explored that in our series on how to read the New Testament letters at length.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the same letter, you'll find greet one another in the church with a holy kiss. Drink a little wine. Don't just drink only water. And also appoint deacons and elders and, all these instructions. And, which ones are binding for the rule book and so on.
And there's a really strong impulse to want to have the Bible help us decide what is good and bad.
That's right.
Because we don't want to go off the rails. And there's this concern of if you don't treat the Bible as a rule book, or if you can't at least find enough rules in the Bible that keep us in the rails, then it's all going to just fall apart.
Yeah, we've been problematizing this approach. So let's name what is also a right intuition underneath this. That the Bible, the texts that are in the Bible, were designed to give instruction and guidance to God's people about what is right and what is just and what is good and beautiful, so that God's people can live in a certain way in the world. It's a vision of what it means to be a human.
Be righteous.
Yeah.
To use a biblical word.
Yeah, to do right by God and other people. So the Bible is a set of texts that are designed to shape people who know how to discern what's good and bad. And without a doubt, that's what they're designed to do. And they explicitly talk about that. What we're talking about is how you engage the Bible to help it do that in the life of a person or a community. And what we're saying is a reference book. What do I do in this situation? Turn to this page, turn to this sentence. That's not an approach that engages the Bible the way it's designed to do that. And so for me, it points all the way back to whatever moral or ethical guidance the Bible is giving. It's not a systematic statement of that as such. If it was, it would be a lot more clear to a lot more people throughout the last, few millennia.
We need your help. Ring Them Bells is a nonprofit organization where every dollar donated goes right back into the mission of spreading the good news and helping those in need. The main ministry of Ring Them Bells is serving those in need in the name of our King Jesus. Over the past year, we have fed over 2,000 meals, and next year, we want to double that. We can't do this without your support. Everything we create here and all of the food that we serve is free because it's paid for by generous viewers just like you. If you feel led to donate and join the mission with us here at Ring Them Bells, click the Give Butter link in the notes and comments of this video. If you can't support us financially, please continue to like and share the content, as this helps us so much with spreading the good news about what Jesus has done for our world.
So the way that communities get moral and ethical guidance from the scriptures is a dynamic process. And the way a given tradition has developed a way of doing that, it's very easy to think, well, that's the way it ought to be done. And I do think there are better, more helpful and less helpful ways that communities do that. But it is a dynamic process. Yeah, the whole premise of the first story of humans in the Bible is about who gets to define what's good and what's bad.
And God gets to.
Humans are God.
Yeah.
That's what the whole story is about. It's about producing people who can discern what's good from what's not good.
And the Torah itself, the Bible itself, was thought of as a tree of life that's supposed to bring you to help you understand.
Absolutely. So moral or ethical formation of people and their character and of communities and how they live in the world. But the question is, how do I get the Bible
Yes.
How does the Bible accomplish that
and
task?
it's not by treating it as a handbook.
And treating it as a rule book
won't get you there.
Won't allow the Bible to do what it was designed to do. The communities that are going to embody that ethical vision, that moral vision of what it means to be human, will be a whole bunch of diverse expressions because the human family, there's so many different cultures. It does seem to me that there will be core universal convictions that are kind of core to human nature and experience.
Yeah. Like do not murder.
Totally. For example.
So, and this is where it's confusing because that's a law in the Bible. It's a rule in the Bible that Moses gives.
Yep.
And it's also a rule we live by. And it's a rule that you would anticipate every Christian in any context, no matter what, should always live by. So then all of a sudden you're kind of like, oh, well, then the Bible does have rules, and so I need to find more of those in the Bible.
Okay, so that's a good example. Do not murder. So it's formulated as a moral guideline in the Ten Commandments. Jesus himself quotes it, but then also says there's a lot more to it. And he gets underneath it, and he starts to give these case studies examples about how anger and dishonoring people publicly, making fun of them,
calling them names,
devaluing them, belittling language, that this itself is akin to murder. And all of a sudden, you're like, well, is there a rule anywhere of don't ever make fun of somebody or belittle them? Well, that seems to be what Jesus is getting at. Now we're to the question of, as a rule book tells you what to do. Wisdom literature is about forming certain kinds of people who need thin rule books because the spirit and the core convictions that are expressed in different rules are written into their character. And I think this is the vision of human beings that Jesus was trying to paint in
Interesting.
what we call the Sermon on the Mount.
So with what Jesus does with that rule of do not murder, kind of shows you that if you just come and go, okay, there's a rule, do not murder, and then I'm going to not do that thing and I'll be good.
Yeah.
Jesus is saying, like, actually, no, let's meditate on it.
Totally.
Let's treat it as wisdom. What's underneath that? And now all of a sudden, it's not just whether or not you're killing someone, it's how you're the language you use towards people becomes a rule of sorts, a rule of life, a way of monitoring our behavior.
Mm-hmm. And what honoring the Bible as wisdom literature does also, and as narrative and meditation literature, is recognizing there's a lot of other ways the Bible addresses murder that aren't through moral rules. Cain and Abel begins a major motif of depicting violence and murder. It's a profound exploration of the meaning of murder. And then follow the train of that motif through the narrative of Genesis through 2 Kings. And it's a sustained meditation on the problem of violence and murder in human communities. And if you don't have radar to know that there's a narrative exploration of this idea, this moral issue, if I'm only looking for rules, I'm going to miss out on all this other stuff the Bible's trying to say because I was looking for a reference sentence for it. So that's a good example of how using the Bible as a rule book, well, I'll miss out on what other things the Bible is trying to do. And then I'm likely to not even really use correctly the moral rule because just taking the Ten Commandments statement at face value, Jesus himself shows, no, it's so much more. There's more underneath that. I've been in a few settings before where I'm kind of working through this, and certain traditions of Protestants get really twitchy when you're like, the Bible's not a moral handbook.
Right.
And what we're not saying is the Bible isn't trying to shape our view of what's right and wrong. We are saying that. The question is, how does it accomplish that goal? And it actually does it in ways that many Christians haven't even thought to imagine yet. And so while the laws are good and show God's wisdom, they also expose Israel's inability to be God's faithful partners.
I'm following. But when I read the laws, I find a lot of strange stuff. Like not allowing clothing to be made of two different fabrics. Like how does that show God's wisdom?
Okay, so it's important to realize that many of these laws are ancient ritual symbols that set Israel apart, that is, made them holy. So some laws made Israel distinct from neighboring nations, while other laws kept them away from things that in their culture symbolized death, disease, and moral corruption.
Okay, but what about all of the ritual killing of animals?
Sacrifices were also ritual symbols that connected people to God. Since you, a mortal, can't ascend up to God's presence in the heavenly temple, a blameless animal that was offered could go up in your place, covering for your failures so you can know you're accepted by God.
I see. But not all of the laws are ancient rituals. Some of them are just about being a good person and treating others well.
Well, yes, but these laws aren't just about being good. They're about justice, which is a big deal to God. On the first page of the Bible, we learn that every human is made in God's image and is worthy of dignity. And these laws apply that ideal in Israel's day.
So it seems that inside scholarship, we skip over these foundational questions a lot. We go straight to the deep into the pool without ever asking the simple questions. So today, and in a lot of my episodes, I like to do this, to just pause early and let's ask some simple questions that really, like you talked about, are foundational for kind of understanding everything else. The first question that I want to address is to understand what the Hebrew Bible is and what the law is and how they correlate with each other. So I talked to you beforehand. We've got a few short clips that I prepared from the Bible Project that are going to go over these basic questions and give us some discussion that we can go over. So I'm going to share this one first from the Bible Project, going over the Torah. We're going to watch, and then we'll discuss. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Let's do it.
You're most likely familiar with the 10 Commandments in the Bible, stuff we generally take as good advice. Don't murder, don't steal, honor your parents, the list goes on.
And those are just the first 10. There are actually a total of 613 commands, all given to ancient Israel, found in the first 5 books of the Bible, which in Hebrew are called the Torah.
Now, the word Torah is usually translated in English as the law, because it has all of these laws in it. And as you read through them, you wonder, am I supposed to obey some of these, all of these? I mean, what's the purpose of
of the law.
Well, that translation is kind of confusing because while the Torah has laws in it, the book itself is fundamentally a story about how God is creating new kinds of people who are fully able to love God and love others. And when Jesus taught about the Torah, he said that he was bringing that story to its fulfillment.
So walk me through the story and how it's fulfilled.
So the story begins with God creating humanity who rebels. And God chooses Abraham to bless all of the nations through his family, who end up in slavery down in Egypt, and so God rescues them. Then at Mount Sinai, God makes a covenant with Israel, like an agreement. And all of the laws that Moses gives to Israel are the terms of that agreement. They're like a constitution. And so some of the laws, they're about rituals and customs that set Israel apart from the nations. Other laws are about social justice or morality. And by following these, Israel would show the other nations what God is like.
Okay, so the rest of the Torah is just the complete list of laws that Moses gives Israel?
No, the rest of the Torah just continues the story. And the 613 commands are only a selection from that original constitution. And even these have been broken up and placed at strategic points within the story. Now pay attention, because you'll see a really clear pattern. Moses gives the first laws to Israel.
Yeah, don't worship other gods, don't make idols.
And then right after that, there's a story of Israel breaking those very laws.
Yeah, they worship the golden calf.
And so Moses gives some more laws, and then you get more stories of rebellion. Some more laws, rebellion again, some more laws, more rebellion, and you start to see the point.
Okay, so we have the law and the prophets, and they're telling one connected story about God's desire to bless the whole world through a people, Israel, who it turns out needs a new heart.
Yes, and Jesus saw himself as continuing that story.
So that was a rich and full clip, but I want to just specify that what I was trying to get out of that is for our understanding of how the Torah and the Hebrew Bible connect. Is it a story or is it a rule book? Is the narrative of Scripture different from the Torah or the Law of Moses? So answer to those questions and kind of respond to that clip.
Yeah, so I'm big fan of the Bible Project, and I know I've kind of kept up with their podcast over the years. I think there'd probably be little tiny X's and O's where I'd say something differently, but by and large, I agree. Like what the text of scriptures is doing, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, is it's obviously genre-wise, it's not always story, right? It's law code or a prophetic text or a psalm book or other things, but also it, through those distinct genres, it tells this sort of it tells this story of, as the clip mentioned, and as you've recognized, that the story of God and his interaction with his covenantal agreement with this particular people, Israel, and through them, the nations in different ways, but that within that particular story, they are singled out and are given commandments, as they put it in the clip that I think is right, sort of like their covenantal, like, constitution, right? And that these commandments do more than one thing. They do distinguish Israel, qua Israel, but they also, in some texts you'll see, like I think it's Deuteronomy 40, they demonstrate the wisdom of the God that they worship. And so I don't think I wouldn't want to be committed to is it this or is it that, right? It's clearly at one level it's both. I think the commandments occur within the context of a broader sort of macro story. I think I'd be happy to say that. And of course, right. I mean, if the question is, okay, is the Hebrew Bible a rule book? Well, then the answer is no. It's got rule books in it, and it's got lots of rules scattered here and there, but it's predominantly sort of the description of God's purposes for his creation and Israel and the nations and his own acts throughout history that reveal and move those purposes forward.
Yeah, I love that. I think that it's good to emphasize that they're there, but that I love that the point that Tim drew out, and if you want to clarify on this, but this is what I understand to be true as well, is that the 613 that law code that we have represented even in the Torah is not the full representation of what it all was. It was what was selected out and put into that as this narrative historical account that was later given to generations that are well beyond the days of Moses, when you have all the final editors and arrangers, bringing these things together. And that's important to understand as we approach to get the truth out of it. You know, it's like, it's the same thing. It's the same question that we wrestle with no matter what subject I'm talking about with another scholar, is like, if we don't foundationally address what the Bible is, like if we don't start there, we can really get off into gray areas of all this other discourse of things that really,
That's
like,
right.
you know, that it's like you said with our understanding of the Torah and, you know, Jesus' relationship to it. We get that wrong. I use this analogy all the time. It's a golf swing. You know, if I swing just a little bit off to the left at the beginning, it's going to go so far away. Where if I can make that slight course correction, it really makes a big difference. So next, I want to move on to our understanding of the Torah and the Hebrew Bible, not just as narrative, which we both agreed there's a meta-narrative that's woven through it. However, differences we may find, we both agree there. But next, I want to see it as wisdom literature. So let's watch this next shorter clip and then discuss.
Well, we need to remember all biblical literature is ancient literature. This is part of our paradigm.
Yeah, this is ancient literature.
It's ancient literature in its wisdom for all later generations of God's people. So we are not the first audience of these commands. The audience of these commands are ancient Israelites, escaped slaves who were having their identity reformed in the transition between the Bronze and Iron Age, you know, in the ancient Near East. And these laws are dialed into that context. And so to simply copy and paste without doing your cultural background homework is likely lead in the long term, or even in the short term, to, I think, misapplication, misuse of these laws. So it's wisdom literature. There's divine wisdom for all of God's people of any place and any time, but we will hear that wisdom by learning to read these in context, literary context and ancient context. And you can see Jesus doing that, and you can see the Apostle Paul doing that by how they draw upon and quote from this section.
You're talking about Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, especially doing that.
Yeah, that's right.
And Paul, when he did it kind of famously with don't muzzle the ox.
Yeah, he did it by quoting from a law in Deuteronomy about how to treat your animal.
Yeah.
And he takes that as a wisdom reflection on how to compensate leaders in a local house church.
Yeah.
Which then Christians throughout history have taken as wisdom for how to compensate clergy in other church structures. So we're all using the Bible as wisdom literature. The point is to become hyper aware of it.
The point is to become hyper aware of it. So before I say another word, Paul, respond to that video and how the law of Moses can be considered wisdom literature.
I mean, obviously, absolutely right. Context just conditions the interpretation, and there's no such thing as an interpretation that isn't conditioned by a context. The question is, are you going to import your own context or try to find one that arises from the text itself, and from the culture that produced it? And so I think absolutely, yeah, it's that point about context is necessary. And there's multiple contexts that are relevant depending on what you're studying. So of course there's the Torah on its own, but then once you're talking about, say, Jesus' interpretation of it, you're not really just talking about the Torah on its own. We know that the Torah had been interpreted for hundreds of years, so that by the time of Jesus's reading, or interpretation rather, he's a member of a culture that already has accepted norms of interpretation of a given commandment, right? So that, when you're reading Jesus's interpretation of a given commandment, you're not just suddenly reading this singular moment who's suddenly out of nowhere rising above his culture and sort of somehow zapping back to the original one and then finding this in a blind, right? Like he's a member of a culture who has inherited generations of interpretation, such that what might not seem straightforward from us in the Torah itself is all of a sudden just an assumed interpretation by the time of his, by his time, and that may well be that Jesus just agrees with that interpretation as well. And so when I'm talking about Jesus in the law, I'm not simply talking about sort of as if I have Jesus sort of like he's got the Torah open in one lap, and on his other lap he's got sort of a commentary by Jacob Milgram, and he's like, okay, but in really the ancient Near Eastern context it was this. It's as if he's like, no, I mean he's reading the Torah within the conversation, the intramural conversation that was already ongoing in what I called late Second Temple Judaism, the Judaism of his period. Now, in terms of the wisdom literature, Yes, I mean, I do think the Bible generally can be described this way as well. And the one way I would not want to say that, I'm not saying this as if the Bible Project has said this. I'm just saying this on my own in case people misunderstand me. Um, Sometimes people will pit sort of wisdom literature sort of over against this. I'm going to use this word casuistry. And casuistry is almost always a negative term. It's casuistry is the practice of reading a commandment, very very particular in its context and applying it to certain cases, and so saying that okay, the commandment has these various conditions in it, and all those conditions need to be met in order for this commandment to be sort of applicable or performed or whatever. Sort of just, in other words, recognizing the case that is before you and all the conditions that contribute to it. So I think some people might say that okay, well, doing that's casuistry, sort of being very specific about all the conditions and reading it very closely, and then applying it maybe even literally, and that's something other than wisdom literature, which is just sort of like kind of vibing with the flow of the or the sort of the inner logic. And I want to say I think you can do both. You can have a person who is reading a text very closely, scrupulously, seeing its conditions and recognizing sort of the legal aspect that's at stake, and then using God-given wisdom and your own comparison with other ethical norms that you see the scriptures requiring, and coming to a conclusion as to how one ought to keep that particular commandment. So I would want to say that yes, it's wisdom literature, but that wouldn't necessarily be disjunctive with, right, close readings of particular laws, and also thinking that okay, these laws ought to be performed because God gave us these laws, right? And so again, I don't say that as if Bible Project has said something other than that. I would just want to make sure that I'm not hurt to be sort of be decoupling those kinds of an approach to the Torah itself.
You're saying it's not a either or, it's a both and, when we can look at it from that side of it. And what I hear you saying, and I think the Bible Project is saying the same thing, you guys are saying at the same time, it takes work.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
The literature is not designed as if some law code that you come to it, you read it like, oh, I got XYZ problem, here's XYZ answer, plug it in, let's roll.
Sure.
That's the point of it being wisdom literature, is it doesn't give up its treasure on the first cursory reading.
Yes.
That actually this is a text of a lifetime that is leading you into this love of God and love of neighbor, as we'll get into later, but that it's leading you to this full lifestyle of being human, and that takes work and effort with the text and within ourselves, that it's not going to give up those treasures on the first end. You've got to meditate on it. That's why we call it meditation literature as well. Yeah. So I don't want to cut you off. Go ahead.
Well, you're actually not expected to notice all of this by yourself or all at once. This dense way of writing forces you to slow down and then read carefully, embarking on this interactive discovery process through the whole biblical narrative over a lifetime of reading and rereading.
Ah, okay. Meditation literature.
Yeah, in Psalm 1, we read about the ideal Bible reader. It's someone who meditates on the scriptures day and night. In Hebrew, the word meditate means literally to mutter or speak quietly. The idea is that every day for the rest of your life, you slowly, quietly read the Bible out loud to yourself, and then go talk about it with your friends, pondering the puzzles, making connections, and discovering what it all means. And as you let the Bible interpret itself, something remarkable happens. The Bible starts to read you. Because ultimately, the writers of the Bible want you to adopt this story as your story.
Oh, sorry. And Tim has that phrase. He says sort of like, it's like cup of tea literature, right? It's like read it, have your tea, read it again, walk around, think about it, right? It's as you said, it's not going to yield its treasure. And that's where I think it's really important to not, and again, not that they've done that, but to not decouple those, because, right, the reflection is only valuable to the degree that you're actually reflecting on what it really says, and to think with it, right? Yes. And so that can, like, sort of that reflection component is best combined with very close attention to detail and reading, and so I think that's a great way of thinking about it. Yeah,
I love that, man. See, we landed there together, and I think I'm gonna I may not play the clip, but let me ask this question because I think it's really important. Because a lot of us, when we think of the law, like we just talked about, we think of this set code. It was said this way. This is the way it's going to be. And really, the Bible doesn't present the Torah or the law like that. So, you know, you have this wonderful quote. I want to read it. The depiction, therefore, of Israel living under the law is not that of a people bearing an intolerable burden by which they struggle to earn their salvation, or a burden causing despair of ever finding a gracious God. On the contrary, the law assured them of God's desire to dwell with them and declare to them the divinely prescribed means through which they could regularly commune with God and experience his forgiveness and grace. And the point here is that this just isn't a one moment in time that this was designed for, that this was designed for future generations as well.
In fact, these laws still underlie many of the concepts of justice and equality that we take for granted today.
But some of the laws don't seem just, like laws that allow for slavery.
Well, if you look at those laws in their ancient cultural context, you'll see that God's working with Israel as he finds them, pushing them towards justice. So slavery isn't abolished, but it is undermined. For example, Israel was supposed to reenact the Exodus liberation by releasing slaves and forgiving all debts every 7 years. This was revolutionary in the ancient world.
All right. Now, what about all the laws about Sabbath rest on the seventh day and all the 7-day feasts? I mean, what's up with all of these sevens?
Yeah, so these laws about sacred time are all connected to the first creation narrative in Genesis. God brings order out of chaos in 6 days that each have a clear beginning and end. But when you get to the 7th day, it has no end. That's because it's pointing to the ideal of humans partnering with God in his rule and rest. All of these 7-day feasts are rituals that symbolize humanity's true purpose and future hope.
Okay, so all of these laws given to Israel can fit into those basic categories.
Yes, and each category expresses a core ideal of God's wisdom. And the laws show how those ideals should be applied in the culture of ancient Israel.
But as the story makes clear, Israel failed at fulfilling the law over and over. How is God going to get humans to trust his wisdom?
Well, Moses and the prophets after him trusted that one day God would transform the human heart, so people can be faithful covenant partners who trust his wisdom. And that brings us to the story of Jesus.
Yeah, Jesus said he came to fulfill the law.
Right. He was the faithful covenant partner that Israel and all humanity was made to be, but has failed to be. Jesus lived by the divine ideals underlying the laws. And he taught that the laws are all fulfilled when you love God and love your neighbor as yourself.
And Jesus promised that God's Spirit would come and transform his followers so they too could live this way.
And so, when followers of Jesus read these laws today, we need to remember they were given to Israel in their ancient cultural setting. You couldn't follow many of them even if you tried.
But what you can do is see God's wisdom in the laws.
Right, and trust that God's Spirit can guide you to follow that wisdom as you learn to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself.
By the time you get to sort of the Jesus's interpretation in the context in which he is interpreting Torah, I think he would probably say that the Torah as we received it is stable and is itself not quite subject to change. I think the way I'd still nuance that though, in the way that you might be getting at, is we see that the Torah itself has to change for subsequent social conditions, right? So, for example, you've got in Numbers 5, right? The people in certain states of ritual impurity, if they have lepra or if they all the various bases upon which they might be rendered impure, they're then told to be removed from the camp. So now that's the law, right? Except, right, they got that law while they're in the wilderness in a camp setting. So now all of a sudden they are, flash forward 100 years or whatever, and they're settled in the land. They're settled in the land and they're not in a wilderness camp setting. And what would it mean to apply this law? And so they don't want to change the wording of it. They want to see that, okay, there was something here that we ought to maintain. and yet they recognize that, well, we're not all on a football field together now, right? Or however big the surface area was, right? Like we're not all within, this quarter mile range, and together, like we're now living hundreds of miles away from each other, and there's this, so how do we apply this? And they eventually came up with a somewhat stable interpretation, which was that they identified the camp of Numbers 5, from which the people ought to be removed, with Jerusalem and or the temple itself. Typically Jerusalem, if I'm remembering correctly. Now the point is that they recognized at that point, subsequent generations later, that they couldn't just look at their solution. Their solution wasn't saying, okay, well, we're not in the camp anymore, so let's take Numbers 5 out of our Bible, right? Their solution was, okay, well, this situation doesn't apply anymore. It can't in other words, it can't correspond one-to-one with our current situation. So now we have to interpret what the camp is. And so then they this is where I think, again, the wisdom literature aspect, they think with the logic of it, they reflect on it, and they think, okay, well, what made the camp, right? It was the fact that God was there in the midst of us with the tabernacle, and we were camped around it. That was why impurity was dangerous there, because you could have impurity proximate to the divine presence. So thinking with that, where is God now? Or in the sense of like, where is his abode? Well, it's in Jerusalem. So let's make the camp law, let's not change its wording, but let's apply it to this particular situation. So there's that. There's also in the sense that its interpretation can become so like there are certain laws that they just recognize at a certain point that, okay, this, whatever it meant then, we don't whether they knew what it meant then or not, they recognize that they're in a situation in which, to quote Sanders, this particular law will just be unlivable. So how do we adopt to it? And how do we make it work, as it were? And if, again, here I'm quoting Sanders, or paraphrasing Sanders' point about this, is he said that this was one of the things that the Pharisees did, is that, there's this law in Leviticus that says, right, like, if a carcass falls into your drink, it's impure, but then all of a sudden, like, and that's all it says, right? But then, like, or carcass of a swarming thing, but then all of a sudden, like, a gnat would constitute that or something, right? Like, it's all of a sudden now we've got this problem with gnats in our drink, and if this law applies to that, then all of a sudden all our stuff would be impure, and we would never. And so they ruled, again, paraphrasing Sanders here, if I'm remembering correctly, that they ruled that the carcass had to be effectively the size of a lentil. So basically a fly, like it had to be a large fly, for this to really count. A gnat, that doesn't count, right? Even though that actually kind of goes against what's written, because the written letter just says carcass of a swarming thing, right? And yet they were like, but well, come on. And so they strained out gnats, and we're fine with that. So that's a good example of, like, okay, adapting to a new situation, either because they just thought that's what it really meant in the first place, or they recognized that what it meant was not really quite, livable. And so they made that change.
Actually, this is hugely significant for this last section, because what we're going to see is how laws, principles, and wisdom of the laws given to the wilderness generation are going to be picked up and transformed. And because the context has changed. And that's actually what makes this section so fascinating. The daughters of Zelophehad. His daughters came near. What you have is this group of daughters who are bringing to Moses and Yahweh the fact that there's a gap in the laws of the Torah. There's a scenario that the laws don't address, and the laws, as currently stated, will lead to what they're trying to say is injustice. A whole branch will be lost from the family tree just because women can't inherit land? That's their argument. So first, God addresses this particular case and says, they're right. This would be wrong for a family to not get land just because it will be women who will be the owners and overseers of that land. So let's change that. Let's address that in this case. And then in verse 8, it turns into a general law. We're watching the formulation of law.
Yeah.
Legal reasoning. Well, I want to pull up the pen and look at it a little more.
Pull it up.
That's right. So, and I think this is often the dynamic, especially that modern readers have, and especially modern Christian readers have when we read the laws of the Torah. Because we're sitting thousands of years forward, post-Jesus, post-Pentecost, and what we can see is that the Spirit has been leading God's people on a journey that has had genuine steps forward in terms of a more perfect realization of the ethic and of the good in the communal life of God's people. And what I'm saying is that the laws of the Torah are not a perfect expression of the ideal will of God for all people, all times, everywhere. This law is saying the laws were given, addressed to certain moments, and then as you watch the law of God and the instruction of God develop and then get developed in the teachings of Jesus.
Yeah, I see that. There's to me, and what I get from reading your book, The Bible Project, and following Jesus, is that there's an underlying logic of the Torah that is built in for the shortcomings of how the Torah approaches culture and context. And whenever one of those things come up, there's an underlying wisdom. And the clip that I had shared was the daughters of Zelophehad, I believe, in Joshua 19. And what happens is these daughters come up and they can't come into the land. They can't because their father didn't have a son. They can't get land.
Yep.
And they go to Joshua and they're like, hey, this isn't right. We should be able to have land. And Joshua takes it to Yahweh, and they literally make we watch law like change,
an amendment,
and an amendment happen in real time because, and this is what I love too, and we're going to get into this because I think this is important. The underlying logic and wisdom of the Torah is always looking for the outcasts and those who are normally shunned and put to the outskirts, right? So like even that one with Zelophehad, like these women, they're destitute, they're on the outskirts. Like, hey, the underlying logic and wisdom of the Torah is that we should be looking out for people like this. So if the Torah is ever putting someone out, then we need to look at this.
I think the Bible does provide a vision of, what is the good and the beautiful, but it provides it within a cultural framework of its authors, namely ancient Israelites and early Messianic Jews living in the first century. So the question is, how do we appropriate their framework and language in contexts that are totally different, in totally different culture and time and place? So it's not a free-for-all, but it is, how do we embody faithfulness to that moral vision of the biblical story? And historically, it's just a fact that Christian communities who pledge their allegiance to Jesus, who believe the scriptures give us a word from God, but they disagree on certain aspects of how to embody that faithfulness in a different setting. And that's just a fact of church history. And so you have to say either something's broken with the Bible, that it didn't provide us with that clarity. And so that's where a lot of people go, is they ditch the Bible. Or they say the Bible is providing a moral vision, but in a way that's different and has given birth to some different traditions and how they go about discerning right from wrong.
Well, isn't there also the position you're just not taking the Bible literally enough?
Oh, sure. Some traditions have that view, but it's my conviction that if you probe far enough, every tradition has its own incoherencies and idiosyncrasies that will show that it is itself a tradition. Yeah. We're getting into actually controversial territory here, I suppose, and that just is what it is. But I think it requires a lot of humility for leaders in different church traditions to be careful that we don't just assume that my tradition's reading the Bible is just its face value, very clear meaning.
Please make sure you're subscribed, turn on the alerts, press that like button, send this out to people that you love and encourage them to share the good news for what Jesus has done for our world.